All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining. Today's program is part of the Presidential Primary Sources Project, and our program today is The Rise of the Cold War. It's being presented to us by the Sixth Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza and the Truman Presidential Library and Museum. The Presidential Primary Sources Project is a collaboration between Internet2, the National Archives, and the National Park Service. It's a free series we put on every year from January through April. This is just a quick reminder that by participating today, you are going to be recorded and archived. We do keep recordings of all of our programs on our YouTube channel, so teachers and students can access them anytime. All right, we absolutely want you to participate today. So if you haven't already, go ahead and find your chat box. It looks kind of like a caption bubble. This will be the easiest way for you to ask questions and share your thoughts today. So go ahead and share where you're joining from and what grade level you are. We'd love to hear from you. There's also an option to be on camera. If you'd like to be on camera, go ahead and leave me a message in the chat and I will work on promoting you. All right, I just want to thank you one more time and direct you to our website. If you're interested in some of our upcoming programs, they are every Tuesday and Thursday through April. And you can also find the links to all the recordings there as well. All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and pass it over to Mark.
Thank you, Therese. Appreciate it. And I see we have some that have already shared where they're from Michigan and Idaho. So welcome. Let me just get my slide share here. That look okay, Therese?
Yep, it looks good.
Thank you. So keep sharing that as we get started, where you're from. We got Michigan sixth grade as well. Thank you, Lakewood Elementary. We are talking today about the rise of the Cold War, and I am Mark Adams at the Truman Presidential Library in Independence, Missouri. And we'll be joined by my friend Genevieve at the Sixth Floor Museum a little bit later on, about halfway through. I'm going to take about 20 minutes to go through my section, then we'll switch and hear the Kennedy administration part, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. We will have some interaction along the way. Most of that's probably easiest to do that via the chat, so I'm asked some questions along the way, so please participate. It always makes it a fun program if there's some interaction. And I see we've got a group from Texas as well. Thank you for putting that in the chat. So this is our opening slide. I'm going to go straight ahead and get started. And we're going to go right into the summer of 1945. So, about almost 80 years ago next year, where President Truman come into the office in spring of 1945 after FDR died. And one of the major things he had to do that summer is meet with the other two major leaders of the time. So who do we have in this photograph? I should ask that really, rather than tell you. Anybody, I'll give you a clue. Harry Truman is in the middle, but who is on either side of him at this big meeting that took place in Germany in the summer of 1945? Any groups identify that just to get us started? Probably a pretty straightforward question to begin the morning. Who else is sitting in these beautiful wicker chairs in this photograph? Don't be shy. Go ahead and type your answer in there. And you can take a guess too. Who do you think? Who's in this photograph? Any guesses? No guesses? Mussolini's not quite right. Mussolini was the leader of Italy, but by then he was deposed. This is after the victory in Europe. So the other countries represented here as a clue are the UK on the left and the Soviet Union on the right. So who would be their leaders in that time in the summer of 1945? Churchill is on the left. Yep. So he's the Prime Minister of Great Britain or United Kingdom at that time. And who would be on the right? The leader of the Soviet Union at the end of World War II. Begins with his last name begins with an S. Stalin, excellent. So we've got Churchill, Truman, and Stalin. Sometimes you see that in a book, describing them as the big three. Those are the three most powerful countries in the world at that time. Interestingly, Churchill is actually replaced during this conference. He loses an election in the United Kingdom, and his replacement is Clement Attlee. So sometimes when you see photographs of this conference, you see Clement Attlee instead of Churchill, as he loses the election at that time, about halfway through the conference. So they meet for 2 to 3 weeks in the summer of 1945, and they're trying to decide what to do, particularly in Europe and in Asia at the end of World War II. But after they decided on some of those things, the Soviet Union violates a lot of those agreements and start to take over various countries in Eastern Europe. I'm not going to list all of those, but you can see the year and you can see the countries, and the Soviet Union starts to expand its empire and either have puppet states or take control of these countries: Albania, Bulgaria, East Germany, Romania, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. So that you'll see that represented on a map here in a moment. So the idea today is we're looking at this rise of the Cold War, and really that's determined by most historians as being between the Soviet Union and the United States. Certainly the UK plays a role as an ally to President Truman and the United States. But the idea is they have kind of differing, even though they've been allies up until the end of World War II, the idea is that the USSR or the Soviet Union, you kind of see both of those names for that country, are tending to want to spread communism across Europe. And the USA is trying to contain that with this policy called containment, which tries to stop the spread of communism and really advocates for capitalism and democracy. So you kind of got these two sides facing off. So I love political cartoons. So we're going to start with one here, and I'd like you to look at it. I'm not too worried about some of the detail on some of the parts of this cartoon, but generally, what do you see? What do you see happening in this cartoon? What do you notice in this cartoon? We've talked about two of the key people already, so if you can identify them again, that would be good. But what else do you notice in this particular cartoon? And any suggestions you can put in the chat. So I really like to analyze cartoons. We use what we call, at the Truman Library, we call visual thinking strategies. And one question that's involved in visual thinking strategies, what do you notice? So tell me what you notice in this cartoon. And really, you can't come up with a bad answer. Playing chess, thank you. Strategy, that's a great word. I've used this cartoon a lot. People don't often come up with strategy. What else do you notice? Stalin looks focused. Yeah, Stalin's on the left, and he's kind of got his hands on his chin, and he's got that pipe, and he's really kind of staring intently at the board. Each of the pieces have names on them. Very good, sharp homeschool. Sometimes it's easier to read than others, and I'm not too worried today about the names on there, but I'm glad you noticed that. What else do you notice? Stalin's on the left. Who's on the right? They're strategically using their pieces or tools. Very good. On the right is Harry Truman. On the left is Joseph Stalin. Excellent. And you guys have it. They're kind of strategically placing their pieces or tools. Are they fighting? Are they at war, do you think? What we would consider a war, with armies and things. Truman looks confident. Good. The castle has a halo light around it. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Doesn't seem like they're fighting. Yeah, it's a Cold War, right? So it's this war of words and war of strategy and war of propaganda. All of these definitions of a war that's not a hot war. If you think of the opposite of a Cold War would be a hot war where bullets are being fired, weapons are being used, bombs are being dropped. In this case, it's a war of strategy. So we use that word, a war of words. saying things to each other that maybe each side doesn't agree with, maybe a war of influence on other countries, but no shots are fired. So I think this is a good example of kind of the Cold War as it begins in the late 40s. Excellent. Great answers there. So I'm just encourage you to continue on that vein. That's really helpful. Okay, so we mentioned these countries that the Soviet Union is spreading into. And Winston Churchill, who we saw in the very first photograph, makes a very, very famous speech called the Iron Curtain speech. And you can see that quote, the famous quote from that speech. Interestingly, he makes that speech in Missouri, where I am today at the Truman Library, and where President Truman was from, Missouri's only president. And actually, Harry Truman was there with him. They traveled on the train together to Fulton, Missouri, which is more in the central part of the state. Independence, where I am today, is in the western part of Missouri. They traveled together, and Winston Churchill makes this speech. And really, the map on the left helps visualize that speech. You can see the countries that he's mentioning: Poland and East Germany and Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. All of those countries are in orange. And then this black line is seen as the Iron Curtain. We won't get into Yugoslavia today. That's kind of they're a communist country, but they're not really under the control of the Soviet Union. They have their own government and their own, less under the leadership of the Soviet Union, unlike these other countries. So Winston Churchill, in this speech in 1946, really talks about the spread of communism from the East to the West. And then you can see the countries bordering that on the West side: West Germany, Austria, Italy. If you fill out the map to the West, you'd have Belgium and the Netherlands and France, and up in the top left corner, the UK, and right at the top would be the Scandinavian countries. Yeah, it was known as the Communist Bloc. And that was the area that Winston Churchill and, of course, Harry Truman was concerned about it too. So that kind of shows you visually this spread from east to west of communism and of Soviet influence. So what is Harry Truman going to do about that? That's kind of his dilemma. If you think about it, there are some parallels today with the Soviet Union, or as we call them now, Russia, spreading into Ukraine. So what is President Biden, or what are the United Nations going to do about that? So similar kind of dilemma, because everybody is really trying to avoid another world war. Yugoslavia, somebody asked why the opposite side. They're run by General Tito, and they have their own independent government. They are communist, but they're not under the control of the Soviet Union. They basically ignored any demands by Stalin. So they are a communist country, but they're of kind of an independent mind. So they're not controlled by the Soviet Empire like all those other countries that are in orange are. So, okay, so the two areas, if we go back very quickly, Greece and Turkey are to the south there of Bulgaria. We've got a close-up map here. You can see Bulgaria again. Greece is right there on the bottom left of your map, and it spreads around to Turkey. So these next two countries at the moment are not part of Soviet influence, but in 1946, 1947, it seems like the Soviets are going to spread there next. So Truman is very worried about that. Like, where are we going to stop the spread of communism? So that's kind of a first crisis point. We're going to look at two or three of these in the time we have. So notice on the map where Turkey is and where Greece is, and you'll see Russia over to the right. And in terms of modern day geography, you can see where Ukraine is. That's so much in the news today. Now, why would the USA, the United Kingdom, France be worried about Russia controlling Turkey and Greece? Why would they be worried about that? Why would they be worried about spreading communism to those two countries, in addition to the ones they already influenced, do you think? Look, the map will help you with that. Westward expansion, yeah. Because they're close to Western Europe, absolutely. What other geographical feature would they have access to? Control of the water. Excellent, Galileo, fifth grade. They've access to the Mediterranean. They control the Black Sea. The water, the ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, the Black Sea are really crucial because if you have access to the Mediterranean, then you can take ships around to Italy, to Spain, out into the Atlantic, even, or even south to North Africa or the Middle East. So the UK, the United States, France, and so on, and other Western European countries were really determined not to let the Soviet Union have access to the Mediterranean. And in fact, that had been the policy since the 19th century of the United Kingdom to stop USA having the Soviet Union having access to that area because they have oceans, because Russia really doesn't have access to the oceans. They've got ports in the north, but they're usually frozen, and they've got ports over in Asia on the east side of Russia, but not in Western Europe. So that was a crucial thing that they were trying to avoid. Excellent job looking at that map. It's a great resource to look at the maps here. So Truman makes a statement in Congress in March of 1947. The crisis comes to a head. The United Kingdom is broke after World War II, and they start to pull out of countries. They pull out of Israel in 1948. They pull out of Greece in 1947. And Truman comes to Congress and is incredibly worried about the problems both in Greece and Turkey. And he asks Congress for support, for financial aid to help support Greece and Turkey and to stop them becoming communist countries. And so this is known as the Truman Doctrine. And it becomes part of his foreign policy, not just to protect Greece and Turkey, but other countries around the world. So this is the quote we see the most. And this photograph on the left is part of that speech that he makes to a joint session of Congress. And he believes that the United States policy to support free people are resisting attempted subjugation, that's a tough word, but basically dominance by armed minorities or outside pressure. So he decides that any country in the world that is being taken over by an outside pressure or outside minority, armed minority like the Soviet Union, then the United States would stand up for them instead. Now, he never mentions the Soviet Union by name in this speech, but he mentions the word communism more than a dozen times in the speech. So he really kind of puts down a marker and says, anybody who tries to interfere with a free country, the United States is going to do something about it. He writes to his wife about this. Bess Wallace Truman is his wife, and in that same month, right after the speech, you can see the letter on the left, and then he hopes the results of the message will be peace. He says it's a terrific step to take. We've been worrying about this, been worrying about what to do in Russia, in China, and the Near East. And then he's very pleased with Congress. He says it was pleasing the way that Congress reacted. Didn't you think it was nearly unanimous? So everybody was in favor. So we have more than 1,300 letters from President Truman to his girlfriend and then later his wife. And this is just one of those. And I've got another to show you a bit later on. And you might be able to make out some of the cursive writing there, but we do have them all online on our website, and they're all transcribed. So you can read the handwriting a little easier. So the aid passes. He gets $400 million passed by Congress. I will say at that time, Congress was led by the Republicans, and Truman was a Democratic president. So he got bipartisan support. So the Republicans supported him, and Truman signed it into law in May of 1947. So they got the aid to Greece and Turkey. And that was successful. It staved off any communist threat in both Greece and Turkey, and he was able to protect that Iron Curtain from spreading to the West. The other policy that he had that kind of comes out of the Truman Doctrine is what's called the Marshall Plan. And this is where he supports all of the countries in Western Europe that were devastated during World War II. So there's a lot of hunger, starvation, unemployment, housing, industry. The war has broken down trade. Europe is in ruins. Secretary of State Marshall makes this famous speech in June of 1947, calling for this new plan of aid to 16 European countries. And eventually, in the April of 1948, that legislation is passed through Congress again. Through a Republican Congress, they get that aid passed. Here's some cartoons I wanted to look at. I've talked enough. I got a couple of cartoons I want to look at. So think about this. Europe is being given this money by the United States into the billions of dollars, I might add. Let's look at this first cartoon, and we'll wrap things up here pretty quickly so we can get to Genevieve. So let's interpret this cartoon very quickly. What do you see in this cartoon? What do you notice in this cartoon? Any comments on this cartoon? The Marshall Plan is saving Europe. So you see Marshall Plan up on the top of the cliff, and then Europe down there. A storm looms above Russia, very good in the background. The textures signify struggle. These are wonderful answers. And you see Europe climbing up the cliff face. Excellent. In terms of time, I want to keep us moving. You did a great job on that one. What about this one? It says on the left, can we afford to help Europe? Can we afford not to help Europe? What comment do you have about that one? Any comments on that one? The bigger question, right? It's a bigger question mark. Not helping is a bigger question, a conundrum. Excellent. These are really good answers. Any last comment on that one? And we'll whiz through the end in a couple of minutes here. Who is the person standing there? We don't know. It's just a representative, right? It's just probably an American, but there's really no indication. It's just a symbol of people wrestling with this question. Should we help Europe or not? Great question. Okay. I'm going to speed along because I want to give my colleague Genevieve enough time to go through her presentation. So he writes to Bess about this too, and he talks about we cannot abandon Greece and Turkey. We need to feed France and Italy. Talks about $16.5 billion. That's how much the Marshall Plan costs. But he talks about the costs we just saw in the cartoon. If we don't help, we would go to war and it would cost us so much more. And so he's writing to his wife kind of with his dilemma. And so this is the countries that got aid in the Marshall Plan, and I can answer questions about that at the end. And then the last piece to wrap up, it comes to a head with the Berlin blockade. Berlin is blockaded by the Soviet Union, cutting off all transport. Now, Germany had been divided during that Potsdam conference that we mentioned at the beginning, and the Soviet Union tries to cut off West Berlin. We don't build a war at this juncture. The war comes late in the 60s. But what Truman does is he flies in supplies because all the roads, all the canals, all the trains have been cut off. And so they start to fly in materials. They land the planes, unload them about 30 minutes, and then fly out again. And you can see some of the statistics there. And they survive. Stalin backs down, and the blockade comes to an end. And West Berlin, about 2 million people, survived the crisis. So it's very close to World War III. And this really shows you the first crisis of the Cold War. So I would encourage you and your teachers and the students to really look at this Berlin airlift, the Berlin blockade, as being the first major crisis of the Cold War where they come close to World War III. And as I said, it lasts about 15 months. The airline is successful. We have flights every 20 to 30 minutes. So it's a huge humanitarian effort. At that time, the biggest in world history. And Truman succeeds. So I'm going to stop there, and I can answer questions at the end. But I'm going to turn it over to Genevieve, who's going to talk more about the Kennedy administration and those Cold War troubles.
Thanks, Mark. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So give me 1 second while I pull that up. All right. Can folks see my screen all right? All right. So I thought that I would start off my presentation. We're talking about John F. Kennedy, who takes office in 1961 um, with a campaign, or actually a pre-campaign photo that he took when he was senator when he was a senator from Massachusetts. He was getting ready to announce his campaign for president, but he was going and doing some pre-campaigning. And one of the stops that he made was in Independence, talking with Harry Truman. And there's this great quote that Harry Truman gave the day after they met to the New York Times. It says, "I've always liked this young man, and he once gave me a check for $28,000 to help build this library." Thought that was a great connection between the two organizations. So in between Harry Truman and John F. Kennedy, Dwight Eisenhower, who was the general during World War II, was president for 8 years. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a little bit about where we are going into President Kennedy's time in office, which started in 1961. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Bay of Pigs, which was an invasion that the U.S. was involved with that was approved by Dwight Eisenhower, but it took place during John F. Kennedy's time in office. Then from there, we're going to talk about one of the closest times that we've come to World War III, and in particular to nuclear war with Russia and Cuba that took place in October of 1962 when President Kennedy was in office. So to get us rolling, I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about the historical context, just like Mark did, talking about the time leading into the different events going on in Berlin and with the Truman Doctrine and all that. Here we have a picture of John F. Kennedy on the right and Nikita Khrushchev, who by 1961, Nikita Khrushchev is the Soviet premier. And he's the gentleman shaking hands. They met in Vienna in June of 1961. It's the only time that they ever met in person for a summit. And the meeting did not go well, especially for John F. Kennedy. You can see I've got a quote from each of them about the other one. So after this meeting, Khrushchev said about Kennedy, said, "This man is very inexperienced, even immature. Compared to him, Eisenhower is a man of intelligence and vision." And Kennedy said about Khrushchev, "I never met a man like this. I talked about how a nuclear exchange would kill 70 million people in just 10 minutes. And he just looked at me as if to, that should say, as if to say, so what?" So clearly neither of them really trusted each other. They weren't impressed by each other. And it really, their relationship got off to a rocky start. Then in August of 1961, President Kennedy had been in office for about 8 months at this point. Construction on the Berlin Wall began, and that divided East and West Berlin. In June of 1963, President Kennedy goes to Berlin. And here you can see he is the gentleman in the suit on the platform on the far right. And he's looking over the Berlin Wall. And you can see there's a lot of razor wire at the top of it. There's a lot of crowds on the western side. But when you look at the eastern side, the side on the right, there's nobody there. But you can see it looks very military, very militaristic on the right-hand side. And it very much represents kind of that division between the two, between communist East Germany and democratic West Berlin. So very much a dividing point between the two ideologies and forms of government that you can see physically here in this picture. In fact, when President Kennedy was there, he gave a speech to cheering crowds that had it so that you could see East Berlin behind him. And sorry, I'm tripping over my words this morning. But by the time, or when Kennedy was looking over the wall and everything, very much in East Berlin, they were trying to show that a show of force in terms of making sure that there weren't tons and tons of people out there that could possibly embarrass them by supporting Kennedy from the other side of the wall. The other thing that we need to talk about is this gentleman here. Can anybody tell me who this person is? Anybody know? So this gentleman is a man by the name of Fidel Castro. So Fidel Castro was the leader of Cuba, and he took over after a coup that overtook the Cuban government, and he ended up he was leading that coup, and he took power as their prime minister on January 8th of 1959. And just a few weeks later, I mean, by April of 1959, he's visiting Washington, D.C., and he does an 11-day goodwill tour, trying to really make sure that his name and his face were out there and trying to generate goodwill towards what he was doing. But that didn't necessarily always happen. By September of 1960, Castro gave a 4.5-hour speech denouncing the United States and saying, calling the United States an enemy, and really embraced the support of Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviet Union, with Khrushchev saying that they would help to defend Cuba in the event that the United States led an invasion. And by January 3rd of 1961, one of the last acts that President Dwight Eisenhower does as president is he severs diplomatic relationships with Cuba. So by the time that President Kennedy takes office, the relationship between Cuba and the Soviet Union and the United States is already very tense. And then we head into the Bay of Pigs. So the Bay of Pigs was an event that took place between April 15th and 19th of 1961. And it was a plan that, like I said, that was developed under the Eisenhower administration, but Kennedy approved it moving forward in February of 1961. So just a few weeks after Kennedy took office. And what the Bay of Pigs essentially was is that the CIA was secretly training Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro. But the plan was a spectacular failure. Approximately 1,200 members of the Brigade 2506, whose flag is here. This is a replica of the flag that's in the museum's collections. The brigade, almost 1,200 of these members of the brigade had been captured, or they surrendered. They had over 100 members killed, and they were held captive or held as prisoners for almost 20 months. They were eventually exchanged in an agreement between Castro and the United States for $53 million worth of baby food and medicine. Somebody was asking, why is it called the Bay of Pigs? That was the name of the area that the invasion took place in. So by December 29th of 1962, just a week before this, the prisoners of war were returned to the United States. And the following week at the Orange Bowl in Miami, they had a ceremony where the brigade's flag was presented to President Kennedy. Now, this failure, the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion, was a major embarrassment for President Kennedy. And he was really concerned about ever getting into a situation like this again. And so it very much influenced how he dealt with relations with Cuba and the Soviet Union moving forward. And I want to just share a map because as we're talking about this, I want to make sure everybody knows where we're talking about. So a quick little geography lesson. So Cuba is located just to the south of Florida. It's only 96 miles between Cuba and Key West, and it's 105 miles from Key West to Havana, which is the capital city of Cuba. So the two are extremely close. And this is going to play a major part of the concern that the United States has during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So to talk a little bit about, and to get started talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, on October 14th of 1962, an American U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba, and you can see some of the pictures that were taken here. And when these flights took place, they discovered that there were Russian missile installations that had been built in Cuba that they had no idea existed. And one of the reasons why this is a major concern is because this now meant that there were nuclear missiles that were in range that they could strike any major city between the East Coast and in the Midwest. One of the gentlemen whose photographs we're seeing is a gentleman by the name of Major Richard Hazer. And there are several pictures that are taken over the course of many, many days. But like I said, on October 14th, photographs are taken. They come back to the photographs are then sent to the CIA, and their analysts start spotting all of these launch sites and different missile installations. And that gave them definitive proof that yes, the Soviets were actually building launch sites and they could strike the United States. The following day, October 16th at 9 a.m., the National Security Advisor McBundy George had the responsibility of having to inform President Kennedy about the presence of these Soviet missiles in Cuba. And immediately Kennedy needs to sit with his advisors and talk about how are we going to respond to this? What are we going to do? This is a major, major concern. And the picture that you're seeing here, this map, it shows the range of two different types of nuclear missiles and where they could strike. So you can see that center circle. You can those missiles could strike as far as Washington, D.C., St. Louis, and the large one could get all the way out to San Francisco. About the only major city that it wouldn't be able to reach would be Seattle. So that's a huge concern. So when Kennedy met with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and his advisors, there were two different perspectives in the room. So you had the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which were military advisors, who really felt that Castro was a major danger to the Western Hemisphere and they needed to remove him. And so we needed to best position ourselves to be ready to fight a war. Whereas President Kennedy, who was still very sensitive to what happened during the Bay of Pigs, was like, we need to have a strategy that's least likely to set off war, especially because we're dealing with nuclear weapons. And nuclear weapons, it could just become an unending fight where nobody wins. And so he was really concerned if we were to get into a position that we were to strike first, that the Soviets would just respond in exactly the same way. And so as they're going into thinking these two different ways, three options were presented. So the first one was that the United States could respond with an air attack on Soviet missile sites. The second is that they could continue their surveillance and diplomacy with Castro and Khrushchev. And the third is that they could do a naval quarantine to prevent any reinforcements, so to stop any additional missiles and materials coming in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give everybody about a minute or so. This is very quick. And part of that is I want you to kind of think about, you're President Kennedy, you are having to make decisions really, really quickly. So you're going to take on the role of President Kennedy and you're going to discuss the three options. And I want you to write your decision of which one you would do in the chat. And I'll pull those three options back up so that you can see them. So I'm going to give everybody about a minute to do this. All right. So go ahead and have your discussions and consider the three options and let me know which one that you want to, that you would go with and why. All right, we got about 30 seconds. All right, 5 more seconds. All right. So it looks like we've got a few folks that saying that they would do continued surveillance. Wow. Continued surveillance of continuing diplomacy. All right. And then I see somebody says surveillance, but if things get worse, go to a naval quarantine. So here's what Kennedy decided. Kennedy decided on a naval quarantine. And you'll notice that I'm saying a quarantine and not a blockade. I'm not saying the word blockade because if it was a blockade could be considered to be an act of war. So he decided on a naval quarantine, and his reasoning was that would provide them with time to negotiate a missile withdrawal. So continuing with diplomacy, which is exactly what a few of you guys have been saying as well. So in the meantime, on October 18th and 19th, we see here a picture of President Kennedy with 3 members of the Soviet delegation to the United States, one of them being their foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko. And during this meeting, which was, by the way, set up before the US discovered the missiles, President Kennedy had a really interesting decision to make. Should he or should he not let them know that, yeah, we've discovered these missiles? And ultimately, Kennedy decided not to say anything. Gromyko, in the meantime, said, oh, no, we are not doing any buildup, anything like that. So both of them are lying to each other. Gromyko doesn't know that the United States has discovered the missiles. And Kennedy's just sitting there in this 2-hour meeting, having to deal with someone who is lying straight to his face. The next day, in the middle of this, when tensions are getting really high, and there's a lot of concern over what might happen during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy has to go and fulfill a promise that he made to make campaign appearances in Ohio and Illinois. And part of the reason he has to do that is because they haven't told the American public what was going on yet. They really hadn't told Congress or anybody else either. So Kennedy goes on these campaign appearances. And when he was in Illinois, he was in central Illinois, and then flew up to Chicago. And then because things were really ramping up, they said that President Kennedy had fallen ill with a cold. And so he was skipping his other obligations and going back to Washington, D.C. And that's how they got him back to D.C., where apparently my picture decided not to join in. On the 20th, he makes that final decision to move forward with the quarantine, but he needs to let folks know what's going on. And so by October 22nd, they're formally organized with lots of meetings. They're letting the cabinet and Congress know, as well as Kennedy calls all three living former presidents to let them know what was going on. So that's Herbert Hoover, Harry Truman, and Dwight Eisenhower. And you can actually hear recordings of these conversations if you go to the Kennedy Library website. So definitely encourage you to do that. We don't have time to play the phone calls on this one, but definitely encourage you to. On October 22nd, Kennedy goes before the country and tells them, hey, this is what's going on. We have evidence of a missile threat in Cuba. We are going to do a quarantine, and he says that they demand that Soviets withdraw missiles from Cuba. In response, Khrushchev and Kennedy start sending letters and messages back and forth to each other. So Kennedy sends a message to Khrushchev that same day through the United States ambassador to the Soviet Union, just basically calling Khrushchev out on this act of aggression and saying, you need to back down. You need, especially and he says, since I have not assumed that you or any other sane man would in this nuclear age deliberately plunge the world into war, which is crystal clear no country could win, and which could only result in catastrophic consequences to the whole world, including the aggressors. So basically saying, if you don't back down, if things escalate, everybody's going to be hurt. And Khrushchev responds and says, no, the missiles are there solely for defensive purposes. If you guys invade, we've got everything all set. And Kennedy's like, you started this. You sent in the missiles. We're not planning on invading Cuba again. So then on October 23rd and 24th, Adlai Stevenson, who's the ambassador to the United Nations, goes before the UN Security Council and tells them what's happening, and says US ships are moving into position. At the same time, Soviet submarines are also moving into place. The Soviet freighters with military supplies halted, and Khrushchev sends Kennedy a note saying, you are no longer appealing to reason, but wish to intimidate us. So basically saying, you're ratcheting things up. This is going to get bad. So here we have a picture, Adlai Stevenson, who is he's sitting at the round table. He's like the second person from the right. If you notice the signs behind everybody that they're all looking at, those are the pictures that were taken on October 14th. And Adlai Stevenson is saying, see, we've got the proof. And the Soviet representative to the United Nations is basically totally called out and says, you need to bear with me, bear with me, bear with me. And Adlai Stevenson just will not let up. In the meantime, a Soviet oil tanker called the Bucharest was approaching the quarantine zone, and they were trying to get to Cuba. So this is like the first test of that quarantine. So I want to know, if you were among the US ships that were making up that quarantine and you stopped the Bucharest, what would you do? Would you stop the ship and go through it, or would you let it go through? What do you think? All right, we've got some folks that are saying intercept the ship. We've got a lot of response saying stop it. Absolutely. So what they end up doing is that Kennedy and the US military do decide to let the Bucharest go through. They didn't find any sort of reason to believe that there were missiles on there. The next day, Khrushchev is put into a really dangerous position from Fidel Castro, not from Kennedy, where Castro sends a letter to Khrushchev saying, you know what, we need to launch the first strike. We need to strike against the United States. And it puts Khrushchev in the position of having to decide, does he agree with Khrushchev and yes, they launch a strike, or does he reach out to Kennedy, say, you know what, we need to de-escalate this? So what do you think? Would you agree with Castro and launch a strike? Or would you reach out to Kennedy and say, we've got to de-escalate this, things have gotten out of control? What's your opinion? Reach out to Kennedy, okay? All right. So, because I know we've got a couple more minutes, I want to make sure that we get through this so we have time for more of your questions. So, but it looks like everybody's unanimous in saying we'd reach out to Kennedy, and that's exactly what Khrushchev did. It was this ultimate level of trust. And the following day, another U-2 pilot from the United States was shot down and killed over Cuba. And Kennedy said, we are now in an entirely new ballgame. There's now been somebody who has been killed. But he ends up going on his trust and his faith and basically decides that Khrushchev wasn't behind the order to shoot the plane down, which he wasn't. Khrushchev then sends a letter to Kennedy saying, you need to withdraw your missiles from Turkey. Remember, we were talking about Turkey when Mark was presenting as well. So Turkey comes into play a couple of times. And Kennedy responds and says that we promise not to attack Cuba after you withdraw. And secret negotiations are happening between the U.S. Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, who was President Kennedy's brother, and Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin, where Kennedy reveals very quietly they were already planning on removing the missiles from Turkey. They just couldn't announce that publicly. So an agreement is drafted, and the agreement comes up as with the final and following details. So the Soviets agree that they will withdraw their missiles from Cuba. The United States will withdraw the missiles from Turkey, and the United States will not attack Cuba after the Soviet withdrawal. So looking at those agreement points, do you agree with the agreement? Do you think that this is a fair agreement? Seems like an okay compromise. Perfect. Well, this is the movement or the agreement that they move forward with. And the picture that you see is actually a letter that is sent from Adlai Stevenson to the Secretary General of the UN saying, hey, this is the agreement that we've all come together on. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Well, actually, I'm going to do one more just to say that that same day, Khrushchev sent Kennedy a note that's saying that he's glad that they were able to come to an agreement. And he gives this great quote and says, I note with satisfaction that you have responded to the desire I expressed with regard to elimination of the aforementioned dangerous situation, as well as with regard to providing conditions for a more thoughtful appraisal of the internal situation, fraught as it is with great dangers in our age of thermonuclear weapons, rocketry, spaceships, global rockets, and other deadly weapons. All people are interested in ensuring peace. So basically what he's doing is he's acknowledging, yeah, this is a really dangerous situation. He was glad that they were able to come to a resolution with even a little bit of a nod to the space race, which was really ramping up and would continue to be going through the end of the decade. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to turn it over to all of you. What questions do you have for us? I know we both have gone through information really quickly, but I'd love to hear what you're thinking about, what additional questions you have. So Lakewood Elementary, you're asking, what was the public opinion of the outcome? I mean, the American public was definitely very concerned about nuclear war. And the Cuban Missile Crisis prompted additional buildup of nuclear missiles. One of the areas that they did a major buildup was out in the Western United States, in particular in Montana. And one of the reasons why they were building a bunch of nuclear weapons in Montana is because there weren't as many people living there. So if they wanted to create a target that would be attractive to a nuclear missile strike, they wanted it to be able to be with the fewest number of people around. And President Kennedy in 1963 in September, just a couple of months before he's assassinated, actually went to go visit one of those nuclear sites just to check in on the buildup during a huge conservation tour that he was doing of the Western United States, and tons of people turned out. So very much the missiles being in Montana, people embrace that, and there's actually a national park site there now that you can go check out. All right. Let's see. Mark, do you want to grab one of the questions that's in the...
Yeah, so this one asks, do presidents usually reach out for past presidents for advice? We saw the example Genevieve gave there where Kennedy reached out to Hoover and Truman and Eisenhower. In Truman's period, really the only president he could reach out to was Hoover, because FDR had passed away and there was no other living president, so he just had one. He did reach out to Hoover pretty regularly. In fact, they became pretty close friends, even though one was Democrat, one was Republican. We have the letters that they wrote back and forth to each other. And then we know from Truman's perspective, not only did Kennedy call Truman in this incident and others, but we do the LBJ library, the Lyndon Johnson presidency, he did reach out to Truman quite frequently, came here, signed legislation here, actually. LBJ signed Medicare legislation on our stage here in our auditorium at the Truman Library. So particularly the Democratic presidents leaned on Truman. Eisenhower did not. So in the 8 years of the Eisenhower administration, Truman was not even invited to the White House. In fact, there's a wonderful photograph in a hallway right outside my office of President Kennedy welcoming Truman back into the White House, either on inauguration day or the next day. I forget. It's right at the beginning of his administration. And Truman's got the biggest smile you could imagine because it's 8 years since he's been in the White House. So certainly Kennedy and LBJ did lean on him. Richard Nixon, though, was a Republican, and he came here shortly before Truman's death in 1972, and he came to the library. I don't know if he asked much in terms of advice, but they were fairly cordial despite some anonymity between them in the 1950s. So certainly LBJ and Kennedy leaned on Truman. Truman leaned on Hoover. And there's lots of examples of that. It's a fairly small club of white men that would lean on each other for advice because nobody else really understands, especially when it comes to, are we going to go to war? How are we going to stand up to the Soviet Union, things like that. So really great question. I'm going to let you take this question, Genevieve, and then I'll think about my answer. It's who won the Cold War?
Cold War, I saw that.
It's a great question.
It is. I mean, I think there could be arguments almost both ways. You do see the fall of communism taking place in the early 1990s. I remember being at home. I was a young kid, so I wasn't an adult when this happened. But I remember when the Berlin Wall fell. Yep. My father was at my grandparents' house, and he called over to our house and told my mother, "Quick, turn on the TV. The Berlin Wall is coming down, and people are celebrating." And we actually here at the museum have a piece of the Berlin Wall that we have up with the area talking about the Cold War and kind of looking at this is what was going on during Kennedy's time. But when the museum opened in 1989, it was right at that same time period. So you do see a lot of examples of things like the Berlin Wall. You do see that the Soviet Union really broke up, and that not all of the countries that were involved in the Soviet bloc remained communist. So you do see things that way, but communism does still very much exist. There are countries that very much have that form of government. So, communism didn't disappear, which is what folks, the Americans had hoped, but it doesn't mean that it's exactly the same as it was.
And I would pose a question back. I like this question. Um, are we in a second Cold War now? I want you to, over the next few weeks, maybe debate that in school with the situation in Ukraine and other places around the world. Maybe debate that in the classroom. Have we started when did it start? Did it start with the invasion of Ukraine, or did it start somewhere else? Or is it not a second Cold War? I think it's a really good way to look at a relevant topic, comparing back. Maybe if you decide it is a second Cold War, how do those compare? I think it's a really interesting topic to look at. Thank you for saying it's a great question. It's been on my mind a lot. We've been talking about it with some teacher groups we have here. This summer, we'll probably talk about it with our teacher class that we're doing, that Genevieve is going to come here and work on that with us. So I think that's an interesting one to think about. What makes up a Cold War? What's the definition of a Cold War? Are we in one today? I personally think we probably are, but I can be swayed. China and the US are both getting colonies on the moon. Okay. It's something I didn't know. So
Yeah, it's a race over commercialization of the moon.
yeah.
So we're in
Great
a
questions.
whole
Maybe
whole new
I think
space
we got
race as well.
1 more minute, maybe one more question if we have it.
There was one
Or did we
about
skip by?
negotiating. Yeah. Does the United States still have that type of power to negotiate?
I would say they probably do. It kind of depends on the situation and who you're negotiating with, but certainly sometimes it's done through other means, through the United Nations. We haven't talked much about NATO, but NATO is an important, not so much negotiator, but certainly a military arm to this. Some of these former Soviet republics are now part of NATO, and that's part of the issue we face in Ukraine, because Ukraine wants to join NATO, and the Russians are very upset about that. They're upset about Poland joining NATO and others. So the NATO part we didn't get to, but that's part of the negotiation. In a way, NATO is used as a threat. United Nations, even the European Union, these international organizations are very important in terms of the negotiation, because to do it alone is a little trickier.
All right. Well, we're right at time. I want to thank everyone for attending, and thank you, Mark and Genevieve, for all this great information. We really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us.
I want to thank everybody for their
Yeah.
participation. That was really great participation this morning.
Yes, absolutely. Made things so much more enjoyable to hear other voices besides my own.